There is a millennial individual standing in their kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday evening, mid-argument with their 7-year-old, and a sentence comes out of their mouth before they have time to inspect it. Because I said so, the words land in the room and something happens that has nothing to do with the argument itself. The millennial individual hears their own voice say those 4 words, and for half a second, it is not their voice at all. It is their father's voice in a kitchen 30 years earlier, ending a different argument with the exact same dead-end sentence. The millennial individual stands there, frozen, while their own child looks up at them. And the only thing happening internally is a kind of vertigo. The specific horror of hearing yourself become someone you spent your entire adult life trying not to become. This moment, or some close variation of it, happens to nearly every millennial individual who has children, and to a great many who do not, in friendships, in romantic relationships, in moments of stress that strip away the careful self-construction project of the last 15 years and reveal, underneath it, an inherited script running exactly as written. This is not a small fear. It deserves to be taken seriously, because the mechanism behind it is well understood, considerably older than any individual person's anxiety about it, and almost entirely unconscious in its operation, which is precisely what makes it so unsettling. You do not decide to become your parents. You simply discover in an unguarded moment that some part of you already has. The psychological term for what is happening is intergenerational transmission, and it describes something developmental psychologists have documented extensively: the tendency for patterns of behavior, communication, and emotional regulation to pass from parent to child not through deliberate teaching, but through sustained exposure during the years, when a child's nervous system is actively building its template for how relationships, conflict, and stress are supposed to work. A child does not learn how to argue, soothe themselves, express anger, or handle disappointment by being told how to do these things in the abstract. They learn by absorbing thousands of small, repeated demonstrations, delivered by the adults closest to them, often without any of those adults intending to teach a lesson at all. The tone a parent uses when frustrated, the specific words reached for under stress, the way affection gets offered or withheld, all of it gets encoded, not as information the child consciously remembers, but as a kind of procedural knowledge closer to muscle memory than to a fact you could recite. You do not remember learning to ride a bike either. You just find that your body knows how the moment it is called upon to do it. This is why the millennial individual's own father's sentence can surface in a moment of stress decades later, fully formed, with the exact cadence and word choice intact, even though the millennial individual would have sworn with complete sincerity that they had never once thought about that sentence in the intervening 30 years. They had not needed to think about it. It had been stored somewhere beneath conscious access the entire time, waiting for the specific kind of pressure that originally encoded it. The millennial individual has a particular relationship to this phenomenon that differs in important ways from previous generations, and the difference is worth understanding clearly. Earlier generations, broadly speaking, had less cultural permission and less psychological vocabulary to examine their own parenting against any standard beyond simply continuing what had been done to them. The millennial individual came of age during a significant expansion in the public conversation around childhood emotional development, attachment theory, and the long-term effects of parenting style, much of it arriving through therapy culture, parenting books, and eventually social media in the 2010s and 2020s. This means the millennial individual is, in many cases, the first generation in their family line to actively and consciously study the patterns they inherited, rather than simply transmitting them forward by default. This is a genuinely significant development. It also comes with a specific cost that earlier generations were largely spared. The millennial individual now possesses enough psychological literacy to recognize the inherited pattern the moment it surfaces, which means they experience the recurrence not as neutral, unexamined behavior, but as a kind of personal failure, proof that all the reading, all the therapy, all the conscious effort to parent differently amounts to less than they had hoped. Because here it is again, the exact sentence, arriving on schedule under stress as though none of the intervening work had happened at all. It is worth pausing on why moments of stress, specifically, are when the inherited pattern tends to surface, because this detail explains a great deal about why the fear feels so persistent, despite genuine effort to change. The nervous system, under acute stress, does not default to the most recently learned behavior. It defaults to the most deeply practiced one. Conscious, effortful parenting strategies, the ones learned from books, from therapy, from deliberate intention, require what psychologists call executive function, a relatively energy-intensive cognitive process that handles planning, impulse control, and weighing a situation against a preferred response before acting. Executive function is exactly the resource that gets depleted first under stress, exhaustion, or sudden provocation. What remains, when executive function is unavailable, is the deeper, automatic, procedurally encoded material, the patterns absorbed in childhood, running on some something closer to reflex than choice. This is why the millennial individual can spend years deliberately practicing a calmer response to a tantrum, succeed at it consistently during ordinary moments, and then, on the one evening they are exhausted, running late and dealing with 3 other things simultaneously, hear their father's sentence come out of their own mouth instead. The lapse is not evidence that the practiced new pattern was fake or insufficient. It is evidence that stress temporarily disabled access to it, the same way stress disables access to most effortful cognitive processes, and what filled the gap was simply the oldest, most automatic material available. There is a specific kind of dread this produces that deserves to be named directly, because it tends to operate quietly, underneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary day. The millennial individual, having heard the inherited sentence leave their own mouth, often spends the following hours or days in a state of low-grade hypervigilance, watching themselves for the next slip, treating their own behavior as a suspect rather than simply living their life. This hypervigilance, ironically, often makes the underlying problem worse rather than better, because the anxious self-monitoring itself becomes another source of stress, which further depletes the executive function that was protecting against the automatic pattern in the first place. The fear of becoming the parent creates exactly the kind of pressure that increases the odds of the old pattern resurfacing, a closed loop that can feel, from the inside, genuinely inescapable. This is worth sitting with honestly. The millennial individual is not imagining the difficulty. The loop is real and it is not a personal weakness. It is simply how stress and procedural memory interact in every human nervous system, regardless of how much therapy or self-awareness a person brings to the situation. Here is what the research on intergenerational pattern transmission actually says about how change happens, and it is considerably more encouraging than the moment of dread at the kitchen table would suggest. The transmission of parenting patterns is not a fixed, unbreakable inheritance. It is a probabilistic tendency that can be substantially altered through what researchers call earned secure attachment, a process in which an adult who did not have consistently secure, attuned caregiving in their own childhood actively works, often through therapy, reflection, and corrective relationships, to build a coherent understanding of their own upbringing and consciously construct different patterns going forward. The key finding, repeated across multiple studies on this topic, is that the single strongest predictor of whether a parent breaks an inherited pattern is not whether they occasionally slip back into it. It is whether they have developed what researchers describe as reflective function, the capacity to recognize, after the fact, what happened and why, and to repair it with the child rather than letting the slip stand unaddressed. A parent who says "because I said so" under stress, and then comes back 10 minutes later and says "I'm sorry, that wasn't a real answer. Let me actually explain why I'm asking you to do this," is not failing to break the pattern. They're demonstrating in real time exactly the mechanism by which the pattern actually does get broken. Not the absence of the old material surfacing, but the active, conscious repair that follows it. This reframes the entire kitchen table moment. The horror of hearing the inherited sentence is real and understandable, but the sentence itself is not the data point that determines whether the cycle continues. The repair is, there is also a quieter, less examined side of this fear worth bringing into view, because the millennial individual rarely gives it equal attention to the dread dot becoming one's parents is not an exclusively negative inheritance. Buried inside the same procedural memory that carries the harsh sentence under stress is also the parent's bedtime ritual. The specific way they made a difficult morning feel manageable, the small joke that diffused tension at the dinner table, the unconditional showing up at every recital regardless of how tired they were. The millennial individual, scanning anxiously for evidence of the bad inheritance, frequently overlooks the substantial good inheritance, running alongside it in the very same nervous system. This matters because the goal was never to become a person with no trace of one's parents in them. That is neither possible nor, on reflection, entirely desirable. The goal, more accurately, is selective transmission, keeping what worked, consciously interrupting what did not, and tolerating the fact that the sorting process is imperfect, ongoing, and occasionally produces exactly the kind of kitchen table moment that triggers the original fear. It is worth being precise about something that often gets blurred in. Conversations about breaking generational patterns. The difference between a parent who is actively harmful and a parent who is simply limited by the resources, language, and modeling available to them in their own time. Many millennial individuals carrying this fear did not grow up with cruel or neglectful parents. They grew up with parents who loved them and also lacked the vocabulary, the cultural permission, or the bandwidth to parent the way the millennial individual now aspires to. "Because I said so" was very often the only model the parent themselves had ever been given, deployed under the same depleted executive function that produces the same sentence in their own child decades later. Recognizing this does not excuse excuse harm where real harm occurred. But for the much larger number of millennial individuals whose inheritance is closer to limitation than to cruelty, this recognition changes the emotional register of the fear considerably. From a battle against a villain to a more complicated act of compassion extended backward across a generation. Even while consciously choosing something different going forward, the millennial individual standing in the kitchen, having just heard their father's sentence leave their own mouth, is not watching their worst fear come true. They are experiencing the single most ordinary and well-documented feature of how human nervous systems carry forward what they were given. The sentence surfacing is not the failure. What happens in the next 60 seconds is what actually counts, whether the moment gets left exactly as it landed, or whether the millennial individual does the thing their own parent likely never had the modeling, language, or permission to do. Turn back around, get down to eye level, and say something true. That wasn't fair. Let me try again. That return is not a small gesture. It is, according to everything the research on this subject actually shows, the entire mechanism by which a multi-generational pattern finally bends in a new direction, not through the absence of the old material, which may never fully disappear, but through the presence, finally, of someone willing to repair it. Thanks for watching. If this felt familiar, leave a comment about the sentence that catches you off guard. You are not your parents. You are something more complicated and more capable than that. You are the first one in a long time who noticed.